So this is the time in traditional Protestant worship where it's kind of the centerpiece of worship, where there is a scriptural reading and then a talk, a reflection on that sermon. And College Heights historically has pretty much followed that tradition. In the last year or so, we've always consulted other works, and even more so in the last year. But today, the scripture reading's too long to read. It's 4 chapters in Genesis, but we're going to look at it in a summary way. But today, what I thought I'd do is maybe for once, just take a step back and consider the Bible as a whole. Why is it that we still we draw on this book? We still interpret it, we still study it and pore over every word. So to help me do that, I'm going to share my screen. So here's some reasons why we do read the Bible in general. I mean, there is no other book in Western civilization that is freighted with so much study, interpretation, and inspiration. It's been pored over word by word by the best minds of every generation. Also, biblical themes just permeate our culture. Words and phrases are woven into our literature, our music, our art. It forms our categories of thought, the way we see the visible and the invisible. And even if it were a complete copycat, you might want to be familiar with the original just to be culturally literate. And this isn't true for all the books in the Bible. I mean, it's the main ones, Genesis, Job, Mark, the ones that have been given so much attention. Also, the Bible has survived sustained attacks by the most powerful secular institutions. It's been used and abused to justify the most heinous violent acts, and yet it survives. It still gives forth life, even in our sophisticated scientific world. It never becomes dated. How is it able to do this? And it also, finally, it does speak to local conditions. I mean, you should know that in the Old Testament, Giants are mentioned 3 times, the Dodgers 0. Okay, I'm just saying. So I am going to take as our example what we use today, Noah's Ark. How do we interpret it? It's one of the most well-known and beloved of all First Testament stories. And we have to ask, what's the interpretation of this text? But really, what's the motive? Why do we read the Bible? And given that, how can we approach it? How do we read it? This is basically an outline of the sermon today, what I'm going to talk about. And finally, the process of reading. What's the narrative form? How is the story told? So you all know the Bible. People were wicked. People were careless. And there's a climatological crisis coming that threatens the survival of life on the planet. Does this sound familiar? Noah and we are situated in similar times. Inspired by God, he builds a vehicle that is able to float out the storm. And God essentially tells Noah, listen, pal, I like you, but I can only save you and your family if and only if you simultaneously preserve species diversity, the array of the life force on Earth. And the metaphor of the ark is that all of life is in the same boat, figuratively and literally. And I know climate change is complicated. The sulfur cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. But if we were to pick one guideline, one benchmark against which to test all of the proposals, I can't think of a better one than species diversity. How does this idea affect all of life? And we could make a worthy sermon on this one point, and we can stop right here. But wait, there's more. What about the world we can't touch or measure? What about Noah himself? Here is another sign. A man longs for some life beyond what he sees going on around him, and he hears God calling to build a strange vehicle and to leave his home and go forth from his community to set sail on a pathless land with no clear destination. Along the way, he's helped by God again. He might be aware of this, he might not. And yet he eventually finds a new ground, a new home where he's changed and blessed. What is this but the journey of the hero? It's the same theme we spent 8 weeks on with the Oxfording pictures, the same theme in great older literature like the Odyssey, Beowulf, Paradise Lost, and even modern literature. Just think of Huckleberry Finn and Jim on their spiritual journey, adrift on that raft in the flood of the Mississippi River. So here's an interpretation that uses a very different frame of reference, metaphysical instead of physical. And it's also a worthy line of investigation. So that's right, folks. From reading just this one text, you get not just one, but two valuable interpretations. Sound too good to be true? But wait, there's more. I thought if I used the language of the Home Shopping Network, I could get your attention. Sounds familiar. So let's look at now the structure of the text. How is the story told? So there's always a little, in the great epic stories, there's always a little preamble and preference. And it contains words that are the same or phrases that are echo other stories, usually in provocative or evocative ways. So here's the first line in chapter 6. And you see that the sons of God saw that these daughters were attractive or beautiful or hot, or I think King James says pleasing to the eye. This is exactly the same word that's used by Eve to describe the apple in the tree of knowledge. The beauty of physical senses can be seductive and can distract you from God. So there's many phrases and themes in the Noah story that echo the Garden of Eden. This is a story of destruction that mirrors the story of creation. A few verses later, Noah is introduced as blameless and righteous, or blameless and upright. This is exactly the same phrase that's used to introduce Job, which a book that happens later on in the future. He also walks with God, but this is a very different kind of God. So this is the way the Bible makes sense, that there are these words like chords and phrases like melodic lines to echo other stories, just like movements in a symphony. And it's all integral to the aesthetic experience of hearing the stories. So the Bible is more like poetry than it is like prose. It's simple, open-ended, even vague. It's designed to be heard more than read, to help just free association. So what I've done, instead of reading the whole thing, is just take each verse, or sections of verses, and summarize the topic. What's the main point in a very brief way? These are the first three topics. Noah and his sons are introduced. They talk about all life on earth. It's wicked, it's not doing well, people are careless, and so there's going to be a curse on the earth. Let's look at the first half of the story. This defines the narrative form. Here's the first three things we just considered. Then we talk about the flood is declared. The flood is going to happen. Noah, build an ark. These are the dimensions. I want you to take all living creatures, representative sample, food for them, you are to take care of. Noah enters the ark, and the waters increase, ominous and dramatic. Now let's look at the second half, chapters 8 and 9. The waters decrease, Noah exits the ark. The animals leave the ark. Food, all living creatures, the ark. It's exactly the same topics in reverse order. This is a very definite form, and it's called a chiasm. Very common for the big stories in Genesis and very common in the New Testament. Mark uses it more than anybody. Why is this form used? I'm going to answer that question. But first, I want to draw your attention down to the waters decrease, chapter 8:13. What happens at the beginning of chapter 8? It's the turning point in the story. It's the fulcrum upon which the whole story turns. That verse, the very first verse is that God remembered Noah. This is not obvious, but remember that this flood story is told in the context of all the other flood stories. Everybody had them, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia was the closest. But in all these stories, their stories, the flood results from many gods fighting among themselves. Human beings, well, we're just collateral damage. This one verse is really a summary of the major Hebrew innovations in the cosmology of the world. Number one, notice, one God, monotheism. Two, the event is presented as the Great Flood is an event in human history, not some mythological confrontation in the sky. God is revealed to be on earth, present among us, walking and talking with us. Global destruction is a consequence of our behavior or our failures. So this is a whole nother interpretation to locate the revolutionary message of Hebrew theology in the context of all of the other major religions. But yet, the ideas I just gave you aren't really exciting to us. They're not very new. That's exactly the point. They are so rooted in our subconscious, so pervasive in our frames of reference of seeing the visible and the invisible that we just take them for granted. So we've reviewed Noah's Ark. Let's review what we've learned. Why should we read the Bible? Well, we just said we benefit from the accumulated thoughts of other intelligent spiritual seekers. Today, we heard three plausible, valid interpretations. And because there's multiple interpretations, we not only read the Bible reads you. Scriptural texts are usually deceptively simple, open-ended, even intentionally vague. So all these interpretations are largely your own projections. That's the point of multiple interpretations. Your projections are revealed. Now, the process of reading the Bible. Why that chiastic structure? Because it's really helpful to memorize the story. Remember, the Bible, it's not written like a normal book. It's more of a recording of oral tradition. Now, we have printed books, so we're visual learners. Earlier people were oral learners. Reading a story tends to enter us through our head, which comes to know it. But hearing the story enters through our heart, which comes to experiencing. We get to consider each interpretation. We get the feeling, we get the body, we take it in deep, just like Mary in the Magnificat. We treasure it in our hearts. So we're constantly filling and emptying our hearts. And then we open again to something new. Consider another interpretation. And then let it go. The stories aren't so much about teaching us a lesson so we can follow a rule, although there are books in the Bible that are like that. These stories are more about inhabiting the experience until we breathe it in and breathe it out, and it becomes real. These stories are told in a particular way to discover the authority of our own creation. We are also authors of the Bible, and in this way we can practice experience to get the most out of life. So for me, the Bible is unique. There's so many interpretations. It's just as deep as you are and I am and more. Interpretations are timeless. They're culturally applicable in different times and places, and at different times and places in your own life. They're truly universal themes. And so they can support revolutions in your frame of reference. When you do that, you become ever closer to your true self. Just like God is in human history, God is also revealed in the history of your interpretations, where you were wrong and change, and where you are right and pursue, ever seeking your true self. So that's why to read the Bible. Question: if the Bible is unique, how do you read a unique book? Answer: unique up on it. David Wharton told me that joke. So normally we all read a lot of books, and we're reading either fiction or nonfiction. We read for entertainment or for information. Sacred reading is about inward formation. It's about awe. And it takes some time and some preparation. Here is Noah's journey. Now, I'm suggesting you can use this as a model for how to read the book. Intention is so important. What is your call? What is your motive? Are you trying to alleviate your suffering? Are you want to see the unseen, non-physical reality? Develop compassion for others? What is your goal? That is the rocket fuel that gets this whole project up in orbit. Then take an inventory, just like gathering all the ends. Take an inventory of your previous interpretations. Clarify your assumptions. The personality that you're now identified with now becomes your point of departure. Have a beginner's mind. What's the vehicle in this journey? There's the text, that'll carry you, but it also carries you engaging the text. So it's the two together, it's that relationship. And you learn how, in that wonderful phrase from Marcus Ford, to read it again for the first time. Don't try to forget your prior interpretations. Bring them with you on the ark, but sequestered below the deck. Read the text aloud. Play the characters. What comes up? Now, the interpretations I identified here, these three that we considered, could easily be found in any liberal Protestant seminary like the Assad, or may I say a liberal Protestant church like College Heights. It's no accident I came up with those interpretations. And so there's a vulnerability in reading and wonder. That's what it takes. You don't have to learn ancient Hebrew. It doesn't require some big problem-solving effort figuring it out. It only requires the effort of wondering over time through devotion. Imagine Noah up on the top deck, alone, at night, at sea. The animals below deck are snarling in the hold. His family's on the second deck wondering, what's the plan here? And his God is unseen up in the starry night, silent. Allow yourself to wonder. Allow that moment. And you will be led to your higher self. Now, we Americans just love simple self-help books. A manual that tells us what to do. What are the 10 habits of self-realized people? Enlightenment for dummies. Friends, you won't find your true self out there. Your true self is in here. Trust that the truth will arise. Remember, the truth wants to be known. I spent a lot of time on the preparation for this talk, but all of the ideas just came to me. I didn't work at it. And ultimately, you return to a new home. A new home that was there all the time. I don't know, my experience is that my true self usually feels like home, more familiar and more comfortable than my old self. And someday you may be called to the same text to read it again for the first time. Now, this path is a lofty goal, and you may not believe it is possible. You may not be up for going through all of this at this time. Just remember that the Bible believes in you that you do have the potential for this, and it will be there when you're up for it. So that's the story of the Bible via the vehicle of Noah's Ark. The good news today and every day is what you create every time you hear the Bible with heart, intention, and vulnerability. But wait, there's more. There's the revolutionary Gospel of Mark, a whole new message, and I hope we get there someday. The real voyage of discovery consists in not seeking new landscapes, but in having new